I'm honored to address the Bay Area Buddhist Association, and I see on the screen many old friends who are gathered here from great distances. It's also really encouraging to see that the association with its different schools, including my home school of Soto Zen, uh, has taken up the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals uh, as an expression of Buddha's way in today's challenging world. Uh, the SDG motto, it might as well be the whole world is my true human body. It also expresses the sentiment, leave no one behind. In the years before the pandemic, for many years, I traveled widely. And wherever I went to a lot of developing countries in Asia and have ongoing work in India, in Burma, and Bangladesh. I never felt they were places that were not intimately connected to me and to all of us. When you see people walking through fields, when you see people working in factories, when you see children playing in the streets, clearly they are true humans just as you and I are.
Recording in progress.
So this is personally moving to me. It's also moving when I look back over the last 30 years of Buddhism as I've known it in the West. There was a time when a focus on something like the SDGs would have been considered and criticized as political. And that would have been criticism could just as easily have been coming from people in our Buddhist schools as from people in the wider world. And I would say that in a sense, they were right. That the goals that we're talking about here are goals for our human activity. They're goals that we do in an interpersonal way, but they're also goals that are not going to be accomplished without political action. But political action is dependent upon our personal transformation, our spiritual transformation, and our social transformation. So the SDGs, before I would define them as a political activity, I would define them as a moral obligation of what we owe to each other as fellow citizens of this planet. And I think that these principles have always been there in the Buddha Dharma. I noticed that in the introductory sheet that I got on the SDGs Day site from the Buddha's teaching of the four major principles found in meaning of practice and verification. And yeah, that derives from Mahayana teachings. In Mahayana teachings, we see this in all the major sutras, sometimes defined as the four embracing dharmas. But we also find it going back to the Pali Suttas. These four principles are giving, kind speech, beneficial action, and cooperation. This is how these are the ways in which we work with each other. We work with each other on the basis of equality and the basis of our ties to each other. And in In the Pali Suttas, this is in the Anguttara Nikaya. It's known as the Sangaha Sutta, the principles of social harmony. So it flows through the entire tradition. I want to talk about maybe some definitions of poverty. But first, I realize that there's been a question that's come up in my household. And I'm gonna give it to you. It's a problem. The problem, my wife, Lori, who's also a Soto Zen priest, we were talking about some things we needed to buy for the Zendo. And I found them on Amazon. And she said, why are you buying that stuff on Amazon? Which is a really good question. And, you know, the first simplistic response was, well, that's where you can get the best price. And, you know, I want to save the Zendo some money. But as we were talking, we realized that in our meal reflections, we have these verses. I'm sure that many of you know them in many traditions. And the first reflection is, innumerable labors brought us this food. We should know how it comes to us. So we can visualize the conjoining of seeds and soil and water and air, and they combine to grow our food. We see the farmer and the field worker. We see the packer. We see the shipper. We see the grocer who works in the supermarket. And all of these labors are included in the food that we eat, all the way from the farm to our table. We might eat from our own garden. That's wonderful if we can. But often the food that we eat travels quite a distance and is handled by many beings. The same is true for everything that we consume. Often those things travel across oceans. In the harbor here in Oakland, you can see the container ships. In the bay, actually in San Francisco Bay, the container ships are backed up to be unloaded from Asia. And where they are made, the things that we consume, they are made and processed by people who live on a small fraction of the wealth that is accessible to many of us. So we face a conundrum. When we shop at Amazon or Walmart or any of the large chains, the prices are attractive. But the question is, what price are we extracting from the people who manufacture and handle these goods? Often the lowest priced goods are manufactured in Asia or elsewhere, in the developing world, where the wages are, as I said, a small fraction of what one might earn in a factory, in a manufacturing job in the United States. And where there are no labor safeguards, there are no health or limitations on working hours or the age of the workers. Many of these factories manufacturing major label goods are little more than prisons. I've seen them. I've seen them in Bangladesh. I've seen them on the border between Burma and Thailand. And continuously, the goods that we consume are made farther and farther away. I've seen this again in Bangladesh, when I went there in 1999, there was an enormous sector of the city of Chittagong that was devoted to factories that were contracted to major textile manufacturers and stores in the West. And I've seen this process of offshoring again in personal experience. And in the late 1960s, I worked in a shirt factory in New York City. And the next year, they closed down a factory which had been there for 25 or 30 years, and they moved it to a kind of a former mill town in New England that was being revived. And that lasted a few years, and then they closed down the mill in New England and they moved their manufacturing to Mexico, constantly in search of the lowest wage. And after about 10 years, they closed the factory in Mexico and moved it to China. So this is the process. And here's a conundrum that I start with, and I think we can come back to this when we lay out a framework, more of a detailed framework of what poverty is. But so we may wish to buy locally. We may wish to purchase, according to the video that Ito-san showed, fair trade goods. Can we find those products? And we recognize, this is part of the discussion that I had with my wife, does it make a difference whether I'm purchasing, say, from Amazon or I'm purchasing from a smaller manufacturer that then sells its good to Amazon? Looking at the fact that they're all going to have, that these are all likely to have international supply chains. The factory workers, for workers in China, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, this is work, and work means survival. And so how do we handle that contradiction, that we are purchasing goods that provide for the basic survival of people, but we're not demanding, we're not insisting on the kind of rights that they would have, that we would expect in this country. And this is, again, from my experience, it's something I don't have the answer to. It seems wrong, and yet I'm not sure how we step around it. In late 1990s, on a trip to Bangladesh, I visited an area of the city of Chittagong where all along the coast of the Indian Ocean, in Chittagong, they are breaking down huge ocean-going ships. And these are, huge tankers and super tankers and merchant ships that are constantly crisscrossing the seas. And they are, at the end of their lifespan, run up on the beach and then taken apart by hand. This is work that used to be done in shipyards in Texas, in the British Isles, but now it's done mostly in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And it's done by people, no hard hats, often no shoes or just sandals, with hammers and torches, breaking these huge ships down to every component, like we hear that Inuit people use all the parts of a whale. All the parts of these ships are used. And when I talked to them, I spent about a week looking at this operation and talking to quite a number of the workers and also to the managers, the people who own these salvage ships, and to vendors along the road who sold everything that they could salvage from the ships: plates, dishes, books, radios, whole motors from ships. When I talked to the workers who were doing the actual ship breaking, they did not pretend it was easy work, but it was work for them. It was dangerous work. There were many injuries, but their alternative was, there was no alternative. They came from upcountry in the north, where there was a tremendous drought, and also where they had discovered a naturally existing stratum of arsenic that was poisoning the wells. So they couldn't use the water for consumption or for irrigation. So here they were making about $2 a day. They were grateful to have the work. How do we deal with this level of inequality in our world? What I'm sort of telegraphing my ending, but I think about the simplest statement of the Buddhist principle of dependent origination. And that statement is simply, when this exists, that comes to be. When this doesn't exist, that doesn't come to exist. With the arising of this, that arises. So I would say, where there's wealth, such as we experience in our country, not for everybody, for some portion of the population, there is poverty. Those two things, the greater the wealth there is, the greater the poverty that is going to exist. It's a very small gesture. But yesterday I heard that Jeff Bezos, who the founder of Amazon, he's worth $200 billion. And his workers in those shops are fighting for bathroom breaks. So if all beings are Buddha, we can't settle for poverty and inequality. And the question is, what is to be done? So let's for a moment, just take a breath, find your feet. I feel some gratitude that we're able to explore this together. Because the problem is greater than my mind can actually resolve. So to change gears a bit, somewhere in my Western mind, I have the expression poverty, chastity, and obedience, which shapes my idea of religious life. And we might think of a Buddhist monk or nun's life in those terms. But in the Pali Canon, Shakyamuni Buddha taught about the middle way, the way between rigid self-denial and excessive indulgence. So the middle way is not a way of extreme poverty. I think we also need to recognize that poverty does not have a single definition, although what it tends to mean is that we can't provide ourselves with the basic requisites for a safe and healthy life. We can't purchase, we can't afford our rent, we can't afford clothes, food, medicine. But the working definition of poverty is not the same in all countries. For the United States, the poverty line is pegged at roughly $13,000 a year for an individual, or $24,000 for a family of four. Deep poverty, which also has an official definition, is roughly half the figure. It's $6,000 for an individual and $12,000 for a family of four. Now, the worldwide figure that the UN is using and that the World Bank is using is quite different. The UN Sustainable Development Goal is targeted for a minimum of $2 a day. How far could we get on $2 a day? That would buy me about 2/3 of a cappuccino. But I also know that standards of living are different, but $2 a day. Whether we're talking about the United States or Asia or Africa, deep poverty is not what Shakyamuni Buddha was putting forward as the middle way. So today, more than 700 million people on our planet live in grinding poverty, deep poverty. These people most of them have no access to the four requisites. And therefore, they have no opportunity really to practice spiritual life because they're always scrambling just to make ends meet. Again, if we go back to the earliest texts in the Digha Nikaya, the Buddha says, from not giving property to the needy, poverty became rife. From the growth of poverty, the taking of what was not given increased. From the increase of theft, the use of weapons increased. From the increased use of weapons, the taking of life increased. So these are the Buddhist words, roughly 22 or 2300 years ago. It seems that he understood and saw these patterns in his own society. So just as we have an eightfold path leading to liberation, poverty has its own path, which is a downward spiral. The good news is that actually in the first 2 decades of this century, the global poverty rate was dramatically decreasing year by year. In the late 90s, the rate was something like 35% of the population of the world. And it reduced to 9 by 1918, 9%. And I will say, again, from my travels, I saw this vividly in Bangladesh, where my first visit in the 90s, I followed up. I was in Bangladesh in 2018, and I just saw a very different country with very different. There were different social amenities and standards, and it was encouraging to see. But in 2020, extreme poverty rose for the first time in 20 years. This is due primarily to the COVID-19 pandemic, but compounded by climate change and regional conflict. In 2021, it's predicted that the pandemic will drive another 150 million people into extreme poverty. So the classic Buddhist texts, both the early Buddhist and Mahayana, speak of liberation in terms of a kind of individual transformation. Freedom from suffering, equanimity in this life, leaving the wheel of birth and death in whatever cycles of existence there are. And at the same time, we are taught that there's no such thing as my suffering. There's just suffering. And suffering is a fact of life in this samsaric world. It doesn't belong simply to me. Contemporary Zen practitioners and all Buddhists, actually, from all the schools I know, are coming to understand that our lives are interwoven into systems and structures. And such structures are, of course, composed of individuals. But these structures are also transpersonal. Structures of oppression, structures of racism, structures of gender oppression. These flow throughout our societies, and collectively we create them. They involve the complex interaction of groups and communities, states, and corporations. So I think of a quotation from Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. This is completely in line with, I think, our Buddhist understanding. He wrote, "In a real sense, all of life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." This is Indra's net, right? This inescapable network of mutuality. So modern poverty is a system that's fundamentally driven by greed, hatred, and by a delusion that we are separate. Poverty eradication is the Sustainable Development Goals' first priority, articulated at the Rio Summit in 1992. At the same time, it's impossible to imagine the end of poverty without recognizing that the Sustainable Development Goals are like twining vines. They are intricately bound up with each other. So we can't imagine an end to poverty without looking at the third development goal, healthcare, or the fourth, education, or the fifth, equality. Or the ninth, meaningful work with 13th, environmental justice, and the 16th, peace. Together, these goals require our individual recognition that we are responsible to all of our brothers and sisters. We're responsible not to turn away from their needs. And it also requires systemic intervention at every level of society. Systemic intervention in government, in industry, down to our temples and churches. These interventions that we have to make as individuals and as people working in combination with others in organization include the following kinds of interventions: improving access to sustainable livelihoods, building entrepreneurial opportunities and productive resources, providing universal access to social services, to develop ways to support those who cannot support themselves, to empower people who are living in poverty and their organizations to take control of their own lives, to recognize the disproportionate impact of poverty on women and children, and to intensify an international cooperation for poverty eradication. So taking a step back, we can consider this path as we look through a Buddhist lens. The precepts, the Bodhisattva precepts, are a guide to how we relate ethically and morally to each other and to ourselves. For myself, I've kind of compressed the precepts to one core principle, which is, I vow not to live at the expense of other life. That means to try to give to beings rather than take for myself. To give to them materially, spiritually, verbally. Poverty eradication is a direct expression of this principle. And like the other Bodhisattva precepts, this idea of vowing not to live at the expense of others is a precept to return to. And perhaps ungraspable in the same way that the Bodhisattvas vow to save all sentient beings or to remove all delusions is so vast, we can't imagine exactly accomplishing it, and yet we try over and over again. It's likewise expressed by the principle of dana paramita, or fusei in Japanese, which means generosity or giving. I've already referenced the Bodhisattva's four embracing dharmas, and in his fascicle by that name, Zen Master Dogen writes, earning a livelihood and managing a business are from the outset nothing other than giving. Entrusting flowers to the wind and entrusting birds to the season may also be the meritorious action of giving. So earning a livelihood or managing a business And what Dogen perhaps saw as a mystical expression, entrusting flowers to the wind and entrusting birds to the season, now is a very real question in our world when the environment is being destroyed at a great rate. We are, rather than entrusting flowers to the wind, we are strip mining hilltops. We're cutting down all the trees, eliminating the flowers, and therefore taking away the home for the birds. So it's not an abstract principle anymore. It's a real question, a real challenge. So where there is wealth, there is poverty. As I said earlier, in this statement of dependent origination, when this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. So where there is wealth, there is poverty. Where wealth is moderated, poverty also may be moderated, and society can move towards a more even footing. I believe this is the kind of business that Dogen has in mind. The eradication of poverty begins with some of the steps outlined above. But in the long run, it depends on the structural and personal modifications of our acquisitive urges, our desires, our willingness to exploit others for what we see as our personal satisfaction. So it's that moderation of our acquisitive urges and our greed, moving towards an economic system which recognizes that we are all in this world. To be put it shortly, it's like we're in this together. Or as Aiken Roshi said, one of his aphorisms, we're in this together and we don't have much time. In the Ananda Sutta, the Buddha describes a householder's 4 kinds of happiness, or sukha. The happiness of earning a livelihood by righteous means. The happiness of giving wealth and good deeds freely to family and friends. The happiness of being free from debt. The happiness of blamelessness and living without committing evil in thought, word, and deed. So living like this, we can acquire the greatest wealth of all, which is just finding contentment in this life and safety in a world where people and nations aspire to justice and seek equality of resources and equality of opportunity. So may all beings be happy, may they be free, and may they live in safety. I'll stop there. And I think we have some time for questions before the breakout groups.